Okay, let's unpack this. You know the Caro Kann defense, right?
Hmm.
That super solid setup for black starts 1.e4 c6, 2.e4 d5.
Mm-hmm. Very solid.
Yeah, builds this sturdy pawn structure. Black's usually feeling, pretty comfortable. But then, what happens when white throws down a direct challenge? When white immediately pushes that e-pawn forward with 3.e5.
Ah, yes, the Caro Kann advanced variation. That's White saying, okay, solid setup, I'm going to try and grab space right away. It's probably White's most ambitious attempt to seize the initiative right on move 3.
Puts immediate pressure on that structure.
Exactly.
Right. And for this deep dive, we've really dug into it. We've got analysis from top GMs, insights from trainers, forum discussions, game databases, basically try and get the full picture of what's going on here.
Yeah, and the goal isn't just like listing moves, it's about helping you understand the main ideas. What's White actually trying to do, and how does Black fight back effectively? Think of this deep dive as maybe a shortcut to getting the core battle of the advanced variation.
Okay, so let's start with white. Why play 3.e5? What's the thinking behind it?
Well, obviously, White's playing for an opening advantage, like always. But 3.e5, it's a very specific way to go about it. That pawn immediately stakes a claim in the center.
Right in the middle.
And crucially, it restricts Black.
Restricts how exactly?
Well, for one, that pawn on e5 immediately stops Black's kingside knight from hopping to f6.
It's the most natural square.
Yeah, it's most natural active square.
Oh.
It also kind of pushes back against Black's d5 pawn. And by girding that space, White is setting things up for potential attacks later on, maybe on the king side, especially if Black castle's over there.
It definitely feels aggressive. Like white is just saying, look, I'm taking this space. Now you deal with it.
It is, absolutely. And the statistics, they seem to reflect that ambition, at least at the higher levels. Sources point out that the advance actually scores better for White than the other main lines against the Caro Kann.
Really? Better scores?
Yeah, White wins significantly more games, percentage-wise. In fact, one GM, Sam Shanklin, he knows the Caro Kann inside out. He apparently calls the advanced variation the, quote, greatest test for Caro players.
Yeah, the greatest test. That's high praise for a third move.
Ah.
But, I mean, it's not automatic, right? White can't just push e5 and expect to win.
Oh, definitely not. It requires real preparation. White needs to understand the pawn structures that arise, the typical piece paths, and absolutely be ready for Black's counterpunches. It's not just a simple pawn push. It's a whole strategic commitment.
Okay, right. So let's flip the board then. You're sitting there with Black. White plays 3.e5. What's that initial feeling like?
Often the first feeling is a bit cramped,
Right.
a little squished maybe.
Squish, okay.
That e5 pawn definitely cramps Black's style, especially on the king side. It tends to lock down the dark squares, which can make life difficult for Black's dark squared bishop and that kingside knight we mentioned.
Where do they even go?
Well, you often see players complaining the knight has to go to like e7 or even h6.
Not ideal squares.
Not ideal squares, no. And the dark squared bishop can feel a bit stuck on f8, at least initially. It feels a bit claustrophobic sometimes.
So, okay, Black feels cramped. What's the fundamental plan? How do you break out and fight back?
Right. This is the absolute key idea for Black. You see it everywhere in the analysis. The .c5 pawn break.
The c5 break.
Yes. That's Black's #1 tool to challenge White's center and carve out some space.
Okay, tell us more. Why is moving that c-pawn, again, you just played c6, now you play c5. Why is that so critical?
Well, it's all about undermining White's pawn chain in the center. Specifically hitting d4 and sometimes even putting pressure on e5 indirectly.
So you're punching back immediately.
Exactly. Black is saying, okay, you took space, but I'm challenging it right now. And maybe just as importantly, it opens up lines, especially that diagonal for the dark squared bishop that felt stuck. Plus, it lets the queenside knight come out to c6, adding more pressure on d4.
Now, I gotta ask, because for someone learning, moving the same pawn twice, like that c6, then c5 feels kind of wrong. Doesn't that waste a tempo compared to, say, the French defense where you might play c5 in one go?
That's a really good question. Very intuitive. And yeah, technically you could argue it costs a tempo, but Black accepts this trade-off. The compensation, the reason the Caro Kann is still considered so solid is that Black's other bishop, the light-squared one.
The one on c8 initially.
Right. Unlike in a lot of French lines, that bishop is not trapped behind an e6 pawn. It usually gets out early, maybe to f5 or g4. That freedom for the light-squared bishop is what Black gets in return for spending 2 moves on the c-pawn. It's a slower approach, maybe, but the aim is long-term solidity and then hitting back with that taunt c5 break.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a trade-off. So the main goal of pushing pawn c5 is to make white react in the center, to break up that pawn structure.
Precisely. Black wants to force white to make a decision. Often, the ideal outcome for black is actually if white takes on c5, playing dxc5.
Really? Letting white take a pawn.
Yeah, it sounds weird, but taking often weakens white's pawn on e5, makes it more of a target. And it opens up lines, files, and diagonals that black can use to get active play and compensation. Maybe attack the d4 pawn, use the open c file. If white doesn't take on c5, then black might take on d4 themselves with .cx d4, which also opens things up, or maybe push past with c4 later. The point is to create instability in white's center, create targets, and loosen that grip by piling up pressure with pieces like nc6, maybe qb6, and getting those knights aiming for central squares like f5.
Got it. So how does black actually implement this taut c5 break? The sources seem to point to two main ways to go about it after 3-point e5.
That's right. The first one, maybe the more traditional way, is to start with 3-point bf5.
Developing that light-squared bishop straight away, taking advantage of that compensation you mentioned.
Exactly. It's the classic, maybe the principled move in this closed system. Get the good bishop out immediately. Now, if you play this way, the .c5 pawn break usually happens a bit later. Often black plays point e6 first and then prepares .c5.
And how does white typically respond to 3-point bf5?
Well, white has a few key ideas mentioned. One is the solid 4bd3.
Challenging the bishop right away.
Yep, aiming to trade off black's active bishop. Now, trading can sometimes help black with their space issues, that's true. If black plays bxd3 and white takes back qxd3, it can sometimes lead to slightly weak white squares for white later on. But if white recaptures with the queen, qxf5, that's often seen as quite comfortable for white. There's actually a famous old game, Nimzowitsch Capablanca from 1927, that's often shown as a good example of black handling this well after bxd3.
Okay, so 4bd3 is about trading or forcing the bishop back. What's the more aggressive option for white?
That would definitely be the flank pawn push, 4.h4.
H4, wow, okay. Attacking the bishop immediately.
Yeah, white immediately tries to gain space on the king's side and maybe harass or trap that bishop on f5.
That looks sharp. How does black deal with that?
Black has a few options, but the main idea is usually to handle the flank threat while still aiming for that central counterplay with c5 eventually. A very common and solid way is 4.8s.
Just stopping h5.
Right. It prevents white from immediately pushing h5 and causing problems for the bishop. Then after, say, 5.g4, the bishop usually just drops back to d7. Black continues developing, maybe with point e6 and d7, and still aims for point c5. That 4.86 followed by bd7 plan is pretty standard. Now, there are much sharper lines too, like playing 4.h5 directly, which can lead to crazy tactical positions.
Like the queen sack lines.
Yeah, exactly. Those lines with qb6 where white might even sacrifice the queen on a1 after e6. Very sharp stuff. But for learning the ropes, understanding the solid 4.86 is probably key. There's also 4.84 directly, which can be met by bd7 or sometimes b4. And of course, white has other moves like 4.nf3, 4.nc3, lots of options.
Okay, so that's the 3-point bf5 approach.
Yeah.
Bishop out early, c5 break comes later. What's the second main strategy for black?
This one is gaining a lot of steam, more dynamic, the immediate counterstrike 3.c5, right away.
The Botvinnik Karl's defense, you called
Yeah.
it, just hit in the center immediately.
Exactly, no waiting around. It's popular because, well, it directly challenges white, and maybe it sidesteps some of the mountains of theory in the main 3-point bf5 lines. It gives black active counterplay from the get-go.
And you mentioned earlier, this leads to French-like structures, but without the bad bishop.
That's a really good way to think about it, yeah. You often get those pawn skeletons, but black's light-squared bishop isn't locked inside on c8. It's already potentially active, or at least has the option to be, which is a big difference.
So how does white react to this immediate 3-point c5?
White's main choice is basically take the pawn or defend the center. The most common move is 4.dxc5.
Taking the pawn.
Yep, accepting the challenge. Black's idea here is usually that they can either win the pawn back pretty soon with active play, or get enough compensation, enough piece activity and pressure to justify being down a pawn for a bit. White, of course, has to play accurately to try and hold on to that extra pawn, maybe using moves like b3, sometimes ideas with b4, or bb5 trying to mess up black's structure.
And if white doesn't take?
Then white usually defends the d4 pawn. The main way is 4.c3. This is solid, keeps the pawn chain intact, but maybe it's a bit passive for white compared to taking. White can also just develop with 4 and f3, sort of waiting to see what black does before deciding whether to take on c5.
And if white does take with 4.dxc5, say black plays 4.e6 to prepare recapturing, what are black's typical ideas then?
After 4 dxe5 e6, black is ready to take back on c5, usually with the bishop. Black might aim to pressure white's e-pawn if it becomes weak, sometimes bring the knight to c6 to hit d4, or even try some surprising dynamic stuff like a quick g7, g5 push on the king side and some lines to stir things up.
What about the kingside knight in these 3-point c5 lines? We said f6 is blocked.
Good question. It has to find other routes for sure. Often it comes out via e7, maybe heading for f5 or g6 later, or sometimes it goes to d7 first, supporting the c5 pawn, or potentially going to b6, or even rerouting over to the king side via f8 and g6. It depends a lot on how white sets up, but yeah, the knights definitely take the scenic route sometimes.
Okay, we've covered the main lines, 3-point bf5 and 3-point c5. But are there some, general tactical motifs or strategic themes that just keep popping up in the advanced variation, things you always need to watch out for?
Oh, absolutely. One really tricky one is what some sources call the immunity of white's e5 pawn.
Immunity. You mean it looks free, but taking it is bad.
Exactly that. Sometimes, especially early on, capturing that e5 pawn, maybe with a knight, looks tempting, but it can walk right into devastating tactics for white. There are examples, even famous ones, where white can sacrifice the queen after black takes on e5, only to regain massive material with checkmate threats. You absolutely have to calculate carefully. Don't assume a pawn is undefended just because it looks that way.
A common trap, then. And white's always trying to use that space advantage, right? To exploit the fact that black might be a bit cramped initially.
Yes, that's a key strategic goal for white. Prevent black from getting fully comfortable, from activating all their pieces harmoniously. There's a game mentioned, Carlsen versus Fedosev, which is a great example. Carlsen used those kingside pawn pushes, h4 and h5, along with queen activity, really putting the squeeze on black's king side when black's pieces weren't quite coordinated yet, and black's king eventually got caught. It's about punishing any awkwardness or delay in black's setup.
And that d5 square seems like it's always the center of attention.
Totally. d5 is critical ground for both players. Black's whole strategy with part c5 is often geared towards controlling or occupying d5. For white, controlling the center often means stopping black from putting a piece firmly on d5. And understanding the pawn structures that come out of this, you might get isolated pawns sometimes after trades on c5 or d4. That's also really important. Knowing the structure tells you which squares are strong, which are weak, which pieces will be good or bad.
So this is clearly a complex opening. If someone wants to learn it, how do they actually get started and get good at it?
Well, like any chess opening, really. You've got to study the main ideas, look at the key variations, and crucially, you have to play it. Practice it in your games. See how these themes actually play out over the board.
Were there any specific learning resources mentioned in the materials that stood out?
Yeah, definitely. For players wanting to play this as white, there was mention of Victor Balgan's video course, Fighting Against the Caro Kann, which apparently gives a repertoire designed to keep black under pressure.
Okay, and for black?
Especially for those interested in that immediate 3-point c5 line, there's a course called Caro Kann, according to Dreve, beat the advanced variation with 3-point c5. It's by two GMs, Alexei Dreve and Pier Luigi Basso. The sources noted it's interesting because both GMs discuss the lines, giving you different perspectives, which sounds pretty useful. And Dreve, in another book, Attacking the Caro Kann, specifically points out that black's problems in the advance are, quote, not easy to solve at all, which really highlights the challenge and why white plays it.
Right, it underlines white's ambition.
Yeah.
And what about using modern tools like chess engines and databases? Any advice there from the sources?
Yeah, the message was pretty clear. They're incredibly powerful tools, but use them wisely. Don't just blindly follow an engine's top move, and definitely don't use engine evaluations to disrespect master analysis without understanding why the engine says what it says.
So use them as a tool for understanding, not just for answering.
Exactly. GMs use engines, but they combine it with deep human understanding. Figure out why the computer likes a move. And databases, like on chess.com or chess games, are fantastic for seeing how strong players actually handle these positions in real games. It brings the theory to life.
Okay, this has been a really thorough look at the Caro Kann advance. Let's try and wrap up the main takeaways.
Sure. So, in essence, the Caro Kann advance kicks off with white's ambitious 3-point e5. White grabs space immediately, clanks down on f6 for the knight, and creates some potential development hurdles for black, especially on the kingside Dirk squares.
And black's fundamental answer, the recurring theme, is that pawn c5 pawn break. Whether you play it right away with 3-point c5, which is more dynamic, or you delay it after the classical 3-point bf5, that break is black's main way to challenge white's center. Open lines, free the pieces, and fight back against that initial cramped feeling.
Yeah, it really boils down to a classic strategic battle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
White's going for space and potential attack, accepting maybe some structural commitments. Black is aiming for rock-solid structure initially, accepting maybe less space, but planning to break things open with that central counterthrust.
So here's maybe something to chew on as we finish up. The Caro Kann advance really highlights this fundamental tension in chess strategy. Do you prioritize immediate space and attacking chances, like white with 3.e5? Or do you prioritize structural soundness and aim for counterplay later, like black often does? It forces you to decide. If you're facing the advance, will you go for the immediate fight with 3.c5 or the more classical setup with 3.bf5? And if you're white, how far are you willing to push that spatial edge? What kind of imbalance feels right for you?